and let me put it in these terms. It really is time in the state of Florida to get serious about public corruption. We've seen way too many examples of corrupt public officials. In fact, I think the last FBI report had Florida leading the nation in really the amount of officials that were indicted for corrupt behavior. And so you understand what this particular measure does. Right now, a bribery or a gratuity is clearly a quid pro quo or something like that in the federal and state laws. Those are easy cases to define, but they're very limited and they don't come along that often. And I think what the state attorney Satz said was very correct. This takes that whole swath of misbehavior, which under state law is not criminalized and ought to be, and defines it in a very precise and surgical way. And I think that's very important because now public officials who are supposed to simply listen to the dictates of their community and their public and their citizens, who now have another tension on them, some undisclosed, some willfully undisclosed conflict, that kind of decision-making, which is corrupted, is now going to be criminalized in the state of Florida. And I can tell you it's very important to have it in the state arsenal. I spent about a decade in the U.S. Attorney's Office in South Florida, from Monroe to Martin County. And most of that time was spent in the public corruption unit. And I will tell you from my experience, I spent most of my time on corruption cases working with people from these gentlemen's offices and Ms. Rundle's office, state attorneys, because the statutes in the federal system and the resources in the federal system were simply better, and they are good public servants, and they wanted cases to be heard in the best form possible. But it is important to give our state attorneys the arsenal they need to truly battle public corruption in the ways it presents itself. And this is what this measure does. It takes all that misbehavior where a public official has to decide between his own personal interests or the interests of the citizens who elected him. And it says, if you make the wrong choice, you will go to jail. That's what this does. And it's very important because right now, there really is nothing in the Florida statutes that criminalizes that behavior short of a quid pro quo, which is often very hard to find and hard to prove. So this is a very significant statute. I believe this year the legislature is going to look at these more seriously than they have in previous years. I've had a hand in almost every piece of corruption legislation over the last decade in the legislature, and there has not been a lot of appetite for some of these measures. I think there is this year. The Senate President has said he is very interested in them. He comes from Palm Beach, which has had its own issues over the last decade. And I think what has happened recently across the state, not just in South Florida, but across the state, has really opened up the eyes of the legislature to the necessity for this kind of strong statement in legislation. So I am very optimistic that this year this measure will pass. I believe it will pass the Senate. I hope it passes the House. And I believe other measures also. Transparency, accountability, and statutory reform. But this, I think, is the most important statute that we can pass this year in the legislature to address head-on what I think has been a culture of corruption in the state of Florida. We'll take questions now.